The frost cracked under her boots, sharp as snapped bones. Late November air, thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves, clawed down her throat. Wind sighed through the gaps in the old stable wall, a mournful sound that seemed to settle in the hollow space behind her ribs. Empty stalls yawned like dark mouths on either side. What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? The question wasn't new. It had gnawed at her since the lawyer's call, a cold, insistent ache, beneath the numbness. Now, standing in the echoing silence of the run-down stable her grandfather had loved, it felt less like a question and more like the ground giving way. Her name was Clara. She didn't think it much these days. She was just the one left, the one sorting through the dusty remnants of a life suddenly, brutally concluded. The lawyer's crisp envelope felt like lead in her coat pocket. Estate liquidation. The words were stamped in black. They included the horse, mixed breed gelding, age unknown, sold as is, $80, the price of a decent dinner out. For a life. She walked deeper into the stable, the beam of her flashlight cutting a shaky path through the gloom. Dust motes danced like frantic ghosts in the light. Hay, old and musty, layered the air. And beneath it, something else. Musk. Sweat. The raw animal scent of a large creature confined. It came from the last stall on the right. The door was solid wood, higher than the others. A heavy chain looped through the latch. She stopped, listened. Only the wind, the frantic skitter of a mouse in the rafters, and a slow, heavy intake of breath. Then the release, a low sigh that vibrated the thick air. She edged closer, her own breath catching. Peering through the gap between the top boards, she lifted the flashlight. He stood in the far corner, head low, facing the wall. Not asleep. Just still. Utterly still, like a statue carved from shadow and neglect. The beam caught the dull, dusty brown of his thick winter coat, matted in places. His mane was a tangled rope hanging over a thick, muscular neck. Plow horse. That much was obvious. Built for pulling, not speed. But it was his stillness that unnerved her. It wasn't calm. It was the stillness of something that has learned the world offers nothing but waiting. Then, a flick. Just a tremor in the muscle of his near shoulder. A ripple beneath the coarse hair. Slowly, as if the movement cost him dearly, his head turned. Not fully. Just enough for one dark, liquid eye to catch the light. It held hers. No fear, not exactly. No curiosity either. Just a profound, weary watchfulness. It was like looking into deep, still water reflecting a storm sky. The weight of that gaze pinned her to the spot. This wasn't just a horse. This was the keeper of her grandfather's last days, the silent witness she hadn't known existed. Her fingers, numb from the cold, fumbled with the heavy chain. The metallic rattle sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. The horse didn't startle. He didn't move at all. Just watched her, that single dark eye unwavering. She pushed the heavy door open just wide enough to slip inside, the smell intensifying. Old straw, ammonia, damp horse, and something else. A faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco and liniment. Grandpa. It hit her like a physical blow, a wave of grief so sharp it stole her breath. She leaned against the rough wood of the doorframe, blinking hard, swallowing against the sudden tightness in her throat. The horse remained motionless. Clara forced her legs to move, taking one slow step into the stall, then another. She kept. The flashlight beam, low, pointed at the straw-covered floor, not wanting to blind him. His ears, thick and coarse-haired like the rest of him, twitched minutely. Back, then forward. Listening, assessing. She could see the thick, corded muscles along his neck and shoulders, powerful even in stillness. One ear, she noticed now, had a jagged notch missing from its tip. Frostbite, maybe. Or something else. She stopped a few feet away, respecting the invisible boundary his stillness created. "Hey," she whispered, the word barely audible. It felt foolish, inadequate. "What do you say to a creature that cost $80 and carried the ghost of your grandfather?" She held out her empty hand, palm down, fingers relaxed. Not reaching, just offering, showing. The horse blew air softly through his nostrils, a puff of white vapor in the cold. His head turned a fraction more, bringing both eyes into view. They were deep brown, almost black, framed by absurdly long, pale lashes. They held an intelligence that startled her, a depth that belied the scrap designation. He lowered his head slightly, just an inch, his gaze shifting from her face to her outstretched hand. His nostrils flared wide, drawing in her scent. Wool coat, city air, grief, and the faint trace of her grandfather's old house soap still clinging to her skin. Seconds stretched, measured only by the rhythmic cloud of his breath and the frantic hammering of her own heart. She didn't move. Couldn't. The weight of the silence, the cold, the sheer presence of this massive, broken animal was immense. He was a monument to labor and disregard. She could see the wear etched into him, the slight sway in his back, the thickened joints, the network of fine white scars like a map of hard times tracing across his shoulders and flanks. One particularly thick, ropey scar ran diagonally over his left shoulder blade. A plow harness gone wrong? A kick? The story was written there, but illegible. He took a step, not towards her, just shifting his immense weight, the heavy hoof sinking, silently into the deep straw. The movement was deliberate, powerful. He wasn't skittish. He was, considering. His gaze returned to her hand. Then, with a deliberation that felt ancient, he stretched his thick neck forward. His muzzle, gray-flecked, and surprisingly soft-looking, hovered inches from her fingers. She felt the warmth radiating from him, smelled the grassy tang of his breath. He didn't touch her, just breathed. Warm air ghosted over her knuckles. Clara held perfectly still, caught between the urge to pull away and the strange, magnetic pull of his quiet investigation. His whiskers brushed her skin, a feather-light tickle. He inhaled deeply again, his nostrils flaring wide. A low rumble vibrated deep in his chest, almost a sigh. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his massive head, not to nuzzle, not to push. He simply rested the broad plane of his forehead, just above his eyes, gently against the back of her outstretched hand. It wasn't affection. It wasn't submission. It felt like an acknowledgement. A heavy, warm weight pressing against her, skin solid and real. The contact was brief. He lifted his head after a moment, his dark eyes holding hers again. Something shifted in their depths. The weary watchfulness remained, but there was a flicker now, a spark of something that wasn't resignation. Clara felt the tightness in her own chest ease, just a fraction. The cold air didn't seem to bite quite as deep. She let her hand drop slowly to her side, the imprint of his warmth lingering on her skin like a brand. She turned, the worn wood of the stall door rough under her palm. The chain rattled again as she pulled the door mostly closed, leaving a gap wide enough for light and air. She needed to leave, needed to breathe air that didn't smell of pipe smoke ghosts and despair. She took a step down the aisle towards the weak gray light filtering through the stable door. Her boots crunched on the frozen dirt floor. Behind her, from the deep shadows of the last stall, came the distinct heavy sound of hooves moving through straw. A pause. Then the soft, rhythmic tread of steps following her own. She stopped, her breath catching. Slowly, she turned. He stood just inside. The open gap of his stall door, his head lowered slightly, his dark eyes fixed on her. Not pushing. Not demanding. just standing, waiting. The chain hung loose beside him. He could have pushed past it easily. He hadn't. He had simply followed her sound. The plow horse, the $80 afterthought, the creature they tried to scrap, stood at the threshold of his confinement, his gaze steady on the woman who hadn't even known he existed until that morning. He didn't move towards her, but the question hung heavy in the frigid air, thick as the scent of hay and old wood. Where do we go from here? She hadn't reached for him, hadn't offered comfort beyond a silent hand. Yet, when she turned to leave the only home he'd likely known for years, the horse had followed. The stable became their fragile sanctuary. Clara named him Atlas, not for strength, though it radiated from his thick frame, but for the invisible weight he seemed to carry, the weight of her grandfather's absence, the weight of his own discarded history. She didn't know his real name. The auction papers listed only mixed-breed gelding, sold as is, $80. The price echoed in her head, a constant jarring counterpoint to the quiet presence filling her grandfather's neglected stable. She came daily, her city clothes smelling increasingly of hay and horse liniment, her hands roughening. She learned the rhythm of his care, the stiff brush pulling dust and loose hair from his thick coat, the careful picking of his massive hooves, the filling of the water trough that always seemed too small for him. He accepted her ministrations with a weary patience, that same profound stillness clinging to him like mist. Yet something was shifting, molecule by molecule. It started subtly. A word. She was talking aloud, filling the silence Grandpa Tom had left, recounting a frustrating work call. And then Mr. Henderson just kept saying leverage like it was some magic word. Atlas, usually dozing in the weak winter sun slanting into the stall, lifted his head sharply. His ears, the one with the jagged notch and its partner, swiveled forward, locked onto her. Not startled, but focused, intensely focused. He blew air sharply through his nostrils. Leverage. The word hung in the air. Clara paused, watching him. The intensity faded as quickly as it came, his head lowering back down, eyes half closing. A coincidence? She filed it away, a small, strange pebble tossed into the pond of their routine. Then, places. She decided to clean out the old tack room, a dusty cave smelling of mildew and ancient leather. Atlas stood at his stall door, watching her drag out cracked bridles and stiff, dry saddles. When she pulled out a particular heavy, worn leather collar, thick, meant for pulling, its brass, fittings dull with age, Atlas let out a low, rumbling nicker, not a greeting sound. Deeper, resonant. He pawed once, a heavy thud on the packed earth floor. His eyes weren't on her, but fixed on the collar lying in the weak light. When she moved to pick it up, he tossed his head, a sharp, agitated motion she'd never seen before. A prickle of unease traced her spine. It wasn't fear. It was recognition, laced with something darker. Resentment? Grief of his own? She left the collar where it was, backing slowly out of the tack room. He settled, but his gaze remained fixed on the doorway for a long time. Objects, an old thermos, dented and scratched, forgotten on a shelf. She picked it up, the familiar red and silver pattern triggering a flood of memories. Grandpa Tom sipping. Coffee in this very stable, steam rising in the cold dawn air. She ran her thumb over a deep dent near the base. "Remember this old thing, boy?" she murmured, more to herself than him. Atlas, who had been nosing at his hay net, froze. He turned his massive head slowly, deliberately. He took 3 steps towards her, stopping just outside arm's reach. His nostrils flared wide, drawing in the scent of the thermos, then her, then the thermos again. He stretched his neck, his muzzle hovering inches from the dented metal. He didn't touch it. He breathed. A long, slow inhalation, then a soft, shuddering exhale that fogged the air between them. His eyes, those deep, liquid pools, held hers. There was no agitation this time, only a profound, aching sadness that mirrored the hollow space inside her own chest. He knew this object. Not just knew it, he remembered it. The connection was a physical thing in the dusty air, a thread pulled taut between the thermos, the horse, and the ghost of the man who had owned them both. Clara resisted the pull, fiercely. Atlas was a responsibility, a link to Grandpa Tom, a creature in need. That was all. Letting him become more felt like opening a door to a room filled with broken glass. She kept her touch practical, her voice calm and measured. She talked about the weather, the price of feed, anything mundane. She avoided words, like leverage, avoided the tack room, put the thermos away. But Atlas watched, always watched, and in his gaze she felt the weight of an unspoken story pressing against her carefully constructed walls. The breaking point came on a day brittle. With cold, a box arrived from the lawyer's office. Personal effects, not previously catalogued. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper, was Grandpa Tom's old pocket watch. The silver casing was worn smooth, the glass face scratched. Her grandfather's. Hands had held this, wound it, checked it against the sun. Her own hands trembled as she lifted it. The familiar weight, the cool metal, was a physical punch. She traced the intricate scrollwork on the back, remembering how he'd let her play with it as a child, the rhythmic tick-tick-tick, a comforting sound. She pressed the catch. The lid sprang open. Inside, tucked behind the face, wasn't just the watch mechanism. There was a small, folded square of faded blue fabric. Linen. Her fingers, clumsy with cold and a sudden, overwhelming tightness in her throat, fumbled it open. It was an embroidered handkerchief. Tiny, meticulous stitches formed a simple, powerful image, a large, sturdy brown horse, head held high, pulling a plow through rich, dark earth. Beneath it, in thread now faded to gray but still legible, were two words: Brave Tom. The air left Clara's lungs in a rush. Not Atlas. Tom. His name was Tom. Her grandfather hadn't just owned this horse. He'd named him after himself. This massive, scarred, discarded creature wasn't just a plow horse. He was Brave Tom, Grandpa Tom's namesake, his companion, his friend. The careful walls shattered. A sob tore from her throat, raw and ragged, echoing in the sudden, awful silence of the stable. It wasn't a single tear, but a floodgate bursting. Grief, not just for her grandfather, but for the bewildered loneliness of this animal, for the indignity of the auction, for the $80 price tag slapped on a creature named Brave Tom, for all the years of labor and loyalty reduced to sold as is. She sank to her knees on the cold, dirt floor, the handkerchief clutched in one fist, the pocket watch digging into her palm in the other. Her shoulders shook uncontrollably. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, lost in a storm of sorrow. She'd been holding back since the funeral. She didn't hear Atlas move. She was only dimly aware of the massive shadow falling over her, blocking the weak light from the stable door. Then, warmth. Immense, solid warmth pressing gently against her side. He hadn't nudged. He hadn't whinnied. He simply stood beside her, his broad, solid shoulder a living wall against the world. She felt the slow, rhythmic expansion of his ribs as he breathed, deep and steady, in, out, a metronome against her chaos. His head lowered, not to investigate the objects she held, but until his warm muzzle was level with her bowed head. He breathed softly, the warm air stirring. Her hair, not demanding, not fleeing the storm of her grief, just standing, anchoring. His presence wasn't a question. It was an answer. He stayed. through the ragged sobs that shook her frame, through the tears that fell onto the dusty floor, through the slow, shuddering breaths as the storm began. To subside, he stood, solid, unmoving, breathing his slow, deep rhythm into the space around her, a silent promise. You are not alone in this. The storm passed, leaving her hollowed out and strangely light. She leaned her forehead against his solid shoulder, the coarse hair scratching her skin, the smell of horse and hay and him filling her senses. It wasn't Grandpa Tom. It was brave Tom, and his quiet strength was a different kind of comfort, real, present, grounded in the earth beneath them both. Weeks bled into months. Winter's grip loosened, replaced by the hesitant green of early spring. Clara's visits weren't just duty anymore. They were a pilgrimage. She didn't just clean the stable. She cleaned their stable. She didn't just bring carrots. She brought apples she'd picked from the gnarled old tree behind Grandpa Tom's house. The brittle silence that had filled the space after her grandfather's death was replaced by a different quiet, a comfortable shared silence, punctuated by the crunch of hay, the soft snorts, the rhythmic rasp of the brush. The change in brave Tom was subtle but profound. The heavy stillness that had cloaked him like a shroud began to lift. He met her at the stall door more often, his ears pricked forward with a flicker of anticipation, not just watchfulness. He'd lower his, head for the halter without hesitation, the wary tension in his neck melting away. Sometimes, when she leaned against the fence, watching the sunset paint the fields in gold and rose, he'd amble over and rest his massive chin on the top rail beside her, his warm breath fogging the cooling air. He didn't demand attention. He shared the space. His eyes, once pools of deep, weary resignation, held a quieter watchfulness now, a softness that hadn't been there before. The scars were still etched into his skin. The sway in his back remained, but he carried himself differently, lighter somehow. One cool, clear afternoon, Clara was clearing out the last corner of the tack room. Spring cleaning. Brave Tom stood in the doorway, watching, his tail swishing lazily at flies. She moved a stack of old, mildewed horse blankets, revealing a small, battered wooden crate shoved into the shadows. It looked like it had been there for decades. As she bent to drag it out, brave Tom stepped fully into the small room. He nudged her gently, insistently with his nose, pushing her slightly aside from the crate. Not aggressively, purposefully. Okay, big guy, she murmured, stepping back. What's so important? He lowered his head, sniffing intently at the crate's lid, which was loose, warped by damp. He nudged it again, then looked at her, then back at the crate. A clear, quiet request. Curiosity piqued, Clara knelt and carefully pried the warped lid off. Inside, buried under a layer of mouse-nibbled straw packing, weren't tools or old tack. It was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Her fingers, trembling slightly, now unfolded the stiff fabric. Inside lay a single photograph, sepia-toned, edges foxed with age. It showed a much younger Grandpa Tom, impossibly young, his hair thick and dark, a wide, proud grin splitting his face. He stood beside a powerful, young horse, its coat gleaming, head held high, eyes bright and intelligent. A horse built for pulling, thick-necked and sturdy. A horse with a distinctive jagged notch missing from the tip of its left ear. Standing proudly beside him, one massive, familiar hoof resting lightly on Grandpa Tom's boot, was brave Tom, in his prime, vital, radiating strength and a fierce bond with the young man beside him, written in faded ink on the back, in her grandfather's looping hand. Me and brave Tom. Spring 55. First plowing. Clara stared at the photograph, then up at the horse standing patiently beside her, his dark eyes watching her face. The young, vibrant horse in the picture, the weary warrior in the stable doorway. They were the same soul. The $80 scrap was once the proud namesake, the partner, the living testament to her grandfather's youth and strength. He hadn't just known Grandpa Tom. He had been his shadow, his companion in the dawn light of his life. He had carried the weight of her grandfather's dreams, his sweat, his pride. And now, silently, steadfastly, he had carried Clara through the heavy dusk of her grief. She reached out, not to the photograph, but to the horse. She rested her palm against the thick, warm muscle of his neck, right where the deep, ropey scar crossed his shoulder blade, a scar undoubtedly earned pulling. A plow alongside the young man in the picture. He lowered his head, his soft muzzle brushing her hair, a quiet sigh escaping him. It wasn't just the photograph. It was the understanding that flooded her, warm and quiet as the spring sun. This horse, this magnificent, overlooked soul, just needed saving. He had been saving her. He had carried the echo of her grandfather's love when she couldn't feel it anymore. He had anchored her when she was drowning. He had shown her that grief wasn't an end, but a landscape to be walked through, step by heavy step, and that sometimes the strength to keep walking comes on 4 quiet feet. She looked into brave Tom's deep, knowing eyes, the ghost of the proud young horse from the photograph flickering in their depths. He blew softly, his warm breath touching her cheek. The silence in the old tack room wasn't empty anymore. It was full of memory, full of presence, full of a quiet, hard-won peace. She leaned her forehead against his, closing her eyes, feeling the solid, steady beat of his life against hers. Sometimes, the ones who carry you through the darkest fields were carrying someone else you loved first. If this story of an $80 plow horse and the silent strength he carried touched your heart, please hit subscribe. Your support lets us find more hidden stories like Brave Tom's. Leave a comment below, tell us what moved you, and tap that bell icon so you'll be here for the next true tale that might just mend a piece of your world. See you tomorrow.